Constitution at all. A living and breathing Constitution is no Constitution at all. I'd like you to think about this for a moment. In the first 7 articles of the Constitution, the word no or shall not is found 24 times. In the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, no or shall not or some derivative of that term is found 22 times. I'm sorry, but I don't quite get how we conclude that the word no or shall not has changed somehow. It's telling the government what they are not permitted to do. The word no did not change from 1788 when it was ratified to 2014. Perhaps we would like it to carry with a different meaning because we would like government to do something different than perhaps what they're doing. But that meaning of that word does not change. Imagine going to an insurance agent after getting into an accident and hearing this. I truly am sorry, your coverage is based upon a living, breathing insurance policy. What you signed up for has evolved and changed. You're not actually insured as you thought. Nobody would sign up for a contract. Nobody would sign up for insurance if, in fact, we recognize that contracts were living and breathing. And Dr. Ray has pointed it out. The Constitution is supposed to be a social contract. So why would we, the people, engage in a social contract if, in fact, the document had no real predictability to it? I think that's part of the problem here. The Constitution, as we look at it, outlined by the founders, outlined specifically what individuals in government were permitted to do, but once individuals operate within the government, they can do whatever they want to do. That was never the intention of our founders. And Dr. Ray has referred to Thomas Jefferson a number of times here, a man that I revere very much. He said this in 1803. Our peculiar security is in the possession of a written constitution. Let us not make it a blank paper of construction. Binding them down with the chains of the Constitution. In 1823 he said this. On every question of construction, let us carry ourselves back to the time when the Constitution was adopted. Recollect the spirit manifested in the debates, and instead of trying what meaning may be squeezed out of the text or invented against it, conform to the probable one in which it was passed. There's all kinds of things that endorse that idea. We have a 10th Amendment that makes it rather clear that those powers not given to the federal government, they ultimately don't have. We can look at Article 6 of the Constitution, which says this, when you look at the oath, support this Constitution. The word is this, support this Constitution. When you look at the idea of impeachment, how in the world could you possibly impeach somebody if individuals in government get to decide what the Constitution means once they get there? This notion that it's somehow living and breathing is silly. It's absolutely silly. The idea behind our Constitution was to outline certain principles. Look at search and seizure, for example. That doesn't say anything about your computer. So, is now a living, breathing document because the founders didn't contemplate a computer? No. It was outlining a specific principle involving property. So that 4th Amendment can be applied even as technology advances, even as we become more innovative. The principle applies. We don't extract something out of the principle simply because we don't like what the founders originally intended.
What are your views on the Second Amendment?
I'm a utopian pacifist. No, really, I am a utopian pacifist. I wish and I long for a world where we live in peace and prosperity. And I long for a world where there is no violence. And I'm ready to disarm. I stand before you tonight ready to disarm and to advocate with you disarmament of the general public. But I will only advocate with you disarmament on one condition. The bad guys disarm first. You get the bad guys to disarm first, I'm with you all day long. But our founders recognize something very, very important. There are bad guys. There are bad guys willing to do violence. There are individuals within government that are prepared to do violence. They recognize something that has gone on over and over and over again since the beginning of time. Men and women with power are corruptible, and they will hurt other individuals in order to achieve more power. That was the very idea behind the Second Amendment. And I imagine that, just a little preemptive striker, I imagine that Dr. Ray is going to talk about the text of the Second Amendment. Because I want to focus on the most important part that says, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And when I focus on that important part, I'm often told, well, you forgot about the first section. which talks about a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. Well, I want to address that. The well-regulated militia clause is a purposive clause. It outlines one of many purposes. Let me just give you another sentence here that is identical in structure to what you find in the Second Amendment. A well-educated people being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and read books shall not be infringed. A well-educated people being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and read books shall not be infringed. Do I only have a right to read a book if I'm a part of what someone establishes as a part of the well-educated electorate? Do I only have the right to keep books if the government decides that I'm a part of the well-educated electorate? No, the idea there is a purpose is being outlined. And the purpose here is we want to foster an environment of a well-educated electorate. And it's the same thing in the Second Amendment. We want to foster an environment of a well-armed citizenry, a well-regulated citizenry. It's not the ultimate purpose, it's one of many purposes. And so there's a couple of purposes behind this. One of them is outlined. The other reflects this idea of natural rights that Dr. Ray referred to a little bit earlier. The inherent right that each one of us have. It exists by virtue of our humanity. We're endowed by our Creator with this idea that we have the right to defend ourselves. I don't have to go to government to ask them permission as to whether or not I can defend myself. It is an inherent liberty. And this comes really from the law of nature, just the same. And somehow there's this idea that if we dehorn the gazelle, the cheetah will go away. If we take away the guns of the people, the bad guys will go away. You wouldn't do that in nature. Hey, let's round up all the gazelles, just to horn them, and the bad, evil guys in nature will just go away. You empower the predators when you disarm the good guys. And the founders recognized that, and they said it much more eloquently than I'm saying it right now. James Madison, Americans need never fear their government because of the advantage of being armed which the Americans possess over the people of almost every other nation. Samuel Adams, that said Constitution shall never be construed to authorize Congress to prevent the people of the United States who are peaceable citizens from keeping their own arms. Thomas Jefferson, no free man shall ever be debarred the use of arms. Goes back to this idea of a living, breathing document. We make this militia clause something that it was never intended to be. We can find purposive clauses elsewhere in the Constitution. We can find it, for example, in Article 1, Section 8, when it talks about the progress of sciences. And because we want to foster the progress of sciences, we're going to protect copyright, trademark. Congress has the job to protect those things. They don't need to determine whether or not those ideas promote or foster progress in science, but that's the overall objective. That's why we've given them that power. The Second Amendment, without shame, I stand before you and tell you that individuals should have free access to firearms. Individuals should have relatively free access to being able to access those things to defend not only themselves, but to defend their loved ones, to defend others that are in harm's way. And most importantly, as Thomas Jefferson said, the ultimate check against a tyrannical government is arms.
James' comments on that decision. And I think in some respects it was an anomaly and an unusual decision. The Supreme Court earlier had found in a decision called Wisconsin versus Yoder that accommodations to religious beliefs must not impinge the interest of third parties. And in another case, TWA versus Hardison, the court said, religious accommodation must not come at the expense of others. Quote from one other case, and then I'll tie this together. In Planned Parenthood versus Casey that was decided in 1992, the court said this: the ability of women to participate equally in the social and economic life of the nation has been facilitated by their ability to control their reproductive lives. The point I'm getting at is if you put those statements together about religion not interfering with third parties and how reproductive freedom is so critical to the social and economic well-being of women, the court erred in its Hobby Lobby decision. Corporations are not drawn from one religion. And the problem comes in, where would this stop? What if an employer's religious belief opposed paying for vaccinations or opposed paying minimum wage? Would those be denied? And of course, it's all part, to me, of the larger problem of corporate and religious influence on American politics, where a religious burden gets imposed on non-believers, and where it puts the personal religious opinion of an employer over the practice of medicine. And I don't think that you can find a constitutional sanction for that. The only other thing that I would say very quickly doesn't relate specifically to the Hobby Lobby decision, but it does relate to, I think, what's at the core maybe of the disagreement tonight or of the discussion tonight is why do we have government? What is the purpose of having government? And I just want to go through some very quickly, and then I'll stop. One, we need some entity, the technical way of putting it is to solve the collection action problem. What that means simply is some device to get people to work together on common endeavors, to accomplish what they cannot do so well alone. Also to control conflicts and settle disputes, to provide security and protection, to provide order, but also to provide justice, both procedural justice and substantive justice, to provide economic justice, to provide social justice, and to provide distributive justice, to provide for public goods, to control free riders, to deal particularly with negative externalities. All of those require, I would say, government, because there is no other institution in 20th century America that can perform that role. Corporations were certainly not designed to do that. And the constant prevalence of market failures provides ample proof that corporations cannot perform these functions. They cannot be performed by voluntary activity. They cannot be performed by charitable organizations. They cannot be performed by religious organizations. So in discussing the Constitution, which sets up a government, it is important, I think, to keep these purposes as to why we have government. And it's possible, I suppose, to say, well, we shouldn't have these purposes. They're bad purposes and they shouldn't be performed by anyone. But if we think that things like security, order, protection, justice are important, those have to be provided by some institution, and government is the only institution that can provide for these. Not the government of 1787, but the government as it is evolved today. I certainly am not happy with everything the current government does. I've had long and hard struggles with the EPA about the Superfund cleanup, and I find them often impervious to public comment. But it's the best alternative that I think that there is.
I will concede that the individual has reproductive rights. The individual has reproductive rights to decide whether or not they want to have children, whether they want to engage in sexual relations. But it is emphatically not the job of the government to force an entity to provide birth control. That individual can go out and provide those things or access those things for themselves. The Hobby Lobby case involved 20 means of contraception. And Hobby Lobby says there are 4 that we object to. And if you look at any one of those 4, an individual could go down probably to any entity that provides abortion services and get that item for free or next to nothing. And so if we're going to conclude that government has to provide birth control. What is the logical extension from that? Are they now going to provide me a bullhorn so I can speak? Are they now going to provide me friends so that I can assemble? Are they now going to provide me a church where I can worship? Are they now going to provide me a gun so I can protect myself? Are they now going to provide me a car so I can travel? All of which are fundamental liberties. The idea is, when we go back to Hobby Lobby and what it is that's going on, you may not agree with what they ultimately did. But just because, and I think this is important, probably the most important thing that I'll say here over the next couple of minutes, just because an individual or a company or a corporation has the right to do something doesn't mean that it will benefit them. And I think that's what oftentimes is assumed on the other side of the argument. If we let them do it, it will benefit them, which is certainly not the case. I believe that market forces are so much more compelling than government forces. If you're trying to eradicate a certain type of behavior, let the market take its course, because the market is brutal. It's absolutely brutal when you allow individuals to vote with their feet. And if people disagree with what Hobby Lobby is doing, let them vote with their feet. But no individual, emphatically no individual has a right to go in, ask if they can be paid to provide a service, and then on top of what it is that they're being paid, saying, you're going to provide A, B, and C for me as well, and if you don't, I'm going to go run to the government, and I'm going to advocate the use of force to make sure you provide those things that I believe I need. That's silliness, and that is not in line with the original intent of the Constitution. It's not in line with the idea that government is to secure the liberties of the people, and it's not in line with the free society. And so I have a little bit more faith, if you will, in people that established this Constitution and those things that were delegated to the government to perform and those things that were left out for the people to decide. And I recognize that we don't live in a utopia. We don't live in a utopian fantasy land, and I think sometimes that's what we get caught in believing, that we're going to somehow get from A to B and there's going to be no tension and there's going to be no problems. Part of living in a free society is dealing with that contest. I think Nietzsche probably said it best. He who hunts dragons must beware lest he become a dragon himself. And I would also look to the 13th Amendment, that of involuntary servitude. You are asking Hobby Lobby to do something that they otherwise weren't obligated to do. And I think whether it's lawsuits and fines or whips and chains, it's all the same.
Created. How can we abolish most federal agencies and return power to states and to the legislative branch? How can we limit, and Dr. Rake talked about this, large corporations like the Federal Reserve? Maybe he did talk about...
How much time do we have again?
Monsanto, that they have too much power, and the government policies dominated by large corporations.
I'm not going to answer all of those in 3 minutes, but I will answer the overarching issue. The way that you eliminate these bureaucracies is start electing individuals with courage. Start electing individuals who will go there and do what it is that they say they're going to do, and that is uphold and keep that oath they've taken. There are all kinds of things that can be done. We have 250 bureaucracies in America today. 2012 imposed 6,100 regulations on the American people. They're not accountable to people. That's obviously problematic. The way you get rid of those things is people with courage in Washington, D.C. who are willing to stand up and say defund. We're no longer going to fund these things. We're no longer going to fund these bureaucracies. And these bureaucracies cannot operate without money. And that was the idea behind the founders when they put this Constitution together, was to ensure that there was an inherent check within that document that was left with the House of Representatives, and is found in Article 1, Section 7. And that is, when other entities start doing things that they're not